There is a perception that the media is very liberal, very biased, produces fake news. Just a decade after Living in Bondage, Nollywood films, made in some 300 languages, were being watched in both urban and rural areas, distributed on both the streets and online, and finding their way into international festivals. Xenophobia is defined as the uncontrollable fear of foreigners. That fear should not dictate the immigration dialogue any longer. There was a time when poetry often made its way to vinyl. Take a deep dive, for example, into the Beat Poets' countercultural albums of the 1950s to 80s. When American poet Alice Notley was very young, she used to sit in front of the radio and just listen. When she got older, she began to hear words and songs in her head everywhere. She went songs she loved, like Begin a Begin by Cole Porter, and her own words that sometimes tumbled out into poems. The term alt-left sprang up long after the term alt-right, which was coined in 2010 by white supremacist Richard Spencer, and defined by the Associated Press just after the 2016 election as a movement based on a mix of white nationalism and hard-edged populism. The costs of running a prison system as large as Arkansas's are significant, and the system's failures can make things worse. Americans don't know the Constitution. More than half of those surveyed can't name any of the rights guaranteed under the First Amendment. Only a quarter can name all three branches of government. I think there is this cliché of Indian men who want a forward-thinking girlfriend but a traditional wife. I think that creates tension in a marriage. Walmart's slogan, "Save money, live better," promises a lot. So does its entrance into Chicago. One of the most bitter complaints of craft brewers is that big beer wins consumers by introducing beers whose names resemble the names of actual, independent beers. After New Belgium came out with a popular beer called Sunshine Wheat, Miller Coors, through its line Incubal brand, came out with a beer called Sunset Wheat. The Brewers Association, a trade group of some 2,000 small and independent brewers, was founded in 2005 to be a passionate voice for craft brewers and craft beer, and it has made itself as vocal as the Bigger Beer Institute. There's perhaps no better way to understand what's happening in a marriage than being inside the home. So often, as a reporter, we have to parachute into places. We don't have much time. We have to make sense of the story as fast as we can. Every Valentine's Day, I pretend I don't care. Like many of us, I say I don't want the flowers or chocolates or a homemade card. How cheesy. I pretend that it's over the top to want the person you like to make you a ridiculously nice dinner, or do some showy gesture, a la John Cusack with the boombox in Say Anything. In Mumbai, I found, people practiced a showy, demonstrative kind of love, one unafraid of affection or emotion. Showy displays of love don't come naturally to everyone. They don't come naturally to me. They also come with a risk of rejection, being made to feel silly, or making yourself into a spectacle. India has a long history with devotional, even obsessive love, be it for a personal god or for your lover. 2017 saw a slew of big pop and hip-hop records, a number of breakout female singer-songwriters and all-girl bands, and the return of beloved 60s soul artist Don Bryant and pop star Kesha. The Museum of the Bible, the sprawling, 430,000 square foot tribute to the Good Book, has been dogged by controversies long before opening day. It's been criticized for not including enough Jesus, for excluding various religious traditions, and for being evangelical propaganda. Antoine Fats Domino was a 1950s rock and roll pioneer, a larger-than-life New Orleans figure, and a role model for the African American community in a time of deep segregation. Hurricane Irma devastated the U.S. Virgin Islands, leveling homes, knocking out power, and turning the landscape into a battered wasteland, where some say media coverage was minimal and help was late to arrive. Leftist, anti-fascist activists, known as Antifa, whose stated goals are to stamp out racism, white supremacy, and authoritarianism, sometimes to use violence. Those who use the term alt-left consistently point to violence from the left, often by anti-fascists, both perceived and real. Videos of Antifa violence, some of them doctored, are regularly shared on conservative, pro-Trump and conspiracy theory-pushing websites, often with commentary that suggests the media purposefully ignores those events. These videos do not often include wider context or numbers. A study by the Parents Television Council, a media watchdog group, found scenes of graphic violence and gore are increasing in TV dramas and, particularly on NBC. Buchanan, population 5,639, is a deeply conservative town and long has been. While coal is its past, oil and gas are its likely future. It's a town where guns are sold at yard sales, where Pentecostal churches are nearly as common as restaurants, and where distrust of Hillary Clinton is visceral and deep-seated. Hindu nationalist outfits like the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh perpetuate a false notion of the love jihad, the false idea that young Muslim men are making Hindu girls fall in love with them to trick them into converting to Islam. What compels the Hindu right's volcanic reaction to Valentine's Day? Some of its members have protested that the holiday is the product of a rotten imported culture from the West. Rock music has always embraced and even represented rebellion, rowdiness, and a robust disdain for social decorum. But along with more classical art forms like theater, opera, and the symphony, it's suffering from the distracted, smartphone-carrying audiences of the digital age. Disco told audiences to dance, while punk told them to be anything but passive. The artists didn't mind, in fact, they encouraged it. Artists know they need to have digital presences to build and bolster their fan base, and fans have exploited that fact. When Neil Young caught two women incessantly texting at a concert in 2012, he began mock-typing on an invisible phone on stage until the women noticed. and apparently left the show. Food deserts on Chicago's South Side have shrunk some since 2006, and this has provided health benefits to the communities. The Food Stamp Challenge, which challenges higher-income families to live as if they are on food stamps, estimates that a person on food stamps has a budget of about $1.25 per meal. In other words, a family on food stamps must buy an entire meal per person for less than the cost of an average cup of coffee. In 1984, protagonist Winston Smith works at a propaganda department for the state called the Ministry of Truth, where inconvenient news can be discarded down a memory hole. Orwell was fixated on the idea that under certain governments, the past can be altered or documents rewritten. Much has been written about Trump's style of speech, which linguists have said is often unintelligible yet deeply compelling. Orwell's famous 1946 essay, Politics and the English Language, centers on the use of abstract words, often by politicians, to obscure reality. I took a job as a reporter in India, where I lived with several married couples, which got me interested in why some marriages work and others fail. Back home, many women of my generation were also putting off marriage or not getting married at all, which only led me to more questions. For most of my life, I, like many Americans, had greeted the idea of an arranged marriage with a mixture of fascination and skepticism. There is no denying that unhappiness, even violence, exists in some arranged marriages, or that some arranged marriages are born out of cruelty. And part of that 6% global divorce rate can be attributed to the powerful stigma against divorce that's present in countries where arranged marriage is common. In any marriage, it seems, love is when you keep paying attention. Certainly, Occupy Wall Street protesters have different ideas about the movement's mission. Many of the marchers I met even disagreed on the purpose of their trek. Some thought it was about getting to Washington to protest the Super Committee. Others thought it was about visiting other occupations. I am not Indian, but I have lived and worked in Mumbai, visited on multiple reporting trips, and celebrated more than one Holi there. Founded by a Mormon couple in Utah in 2012, the Color Run has proved to be a brilliant idea. At first glance, the Color Run does look a lot like Holi. Its website is populated by photos of people throwing colored powder at each other and in the air, outdoors, at the start of spring. The only difference, it seemed, was that there was a 5 kilometers run added in, and that it cost $54.99 to participate. County jails used to be just stopovers for inmates headed to state prisons. But as Arkansas state facilities have reached capacity, jails are increasingly being used to hold prisoners long-term. The lack of space and a growing prison population has strained resources and put pressure on all levels of the penal system. President Obama has shelled out more in federal spending than the 5 presidents that came before him. In 1984, Jim Koch used his family's lager recipe to start Boston Beer Company, which has since become the largest craft brewer in the country. He brews Samuel Adams, a rich lager named after the American Revolutionary, that comes with the tagline, "Take pride in your beer." The battle between craft breweries and big beer stretches back to the 1990s, when the idea of buying a beer brewed by a small, independent brewery first took off. The groups who spend the most on lobbying lawmakers in Washington are well-known: ExxonMobil, Boeing, AT&T, General Electric. Not every dollar spent to gain influence on Capitol Hill comes from a big, global industrial behemoth. Hundreds of small advocacy groups and nonprofits spend thousands each year to lobby Congress and federal agencies on the issues they care about most, and their efforts often go under the radar. Despite allegations by liberal advocacy groups that voter suppression tactics by the right hindered minority voting, blacks represented 13% of the electorate in 2012, a percentage about equivalent with 2008. The American public believes the Founding Fathers were close to infallible and that, while our political system has its faults, it functions far better than other democracies. But is it true? May 2nd is traditionally the National Day of Prayer, a government-designated religious event intended to encourage people to turn to God in prayer and meditation. The American Humanist Association, whose slogan is "Good Without a God," created the National Day of Reason with the Washington area secular humanists to raise awareness about government threats to religious liberty and up the profile of the non-religious community. In the 1980s and the 1990s, when HIV hit its peak, the gay community was at the forefront of the fight against the silent killer. HIV/AIDS isn't a top priority for any of the three major LGBT groups in the U.S., not the HRC, or the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, GLAAD, or the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force, NGLTF, who together are somewhat pejoratively known as Gay Incorporated. Over its 40 years, Muppets on Sesame Street have addressed AIDS, divorce, a parent's deployment overseas, and a death in the family. But the show is addressing incarceration in a way it didn't used to, by bringing the show directly to the kids and families it wants to reach. Sesame Street was built on the idea that a show that could capture a child's attention could also give the child an education. That idea turned out to be wildly successful,